Ever since 1991, Iraq and CNN's 24-hour coverage of Operation Desert Storm, wars in the Middle East have been televised, beamed out by satellite. 25 years have passed, and the internet has changed things. However, the fact remains, the mainstream news media are still the only means through which most of us get any idea of what's going on the battlefield. The United States is once again at war in Iraq, this time supplying the air power required for Iraqi forces to take back the city of Mosul. The enemy is ISIL. Meanwhile, the Syrian city of Aleppo is also under siege by government forces fighting to expel a rebel force. However, the air power is Russian. And despite some obvious parallels, the media representations of these two conflicts could not be more different. Depending on who in the media is doing the reporting and where the loyalties lie, some wars are clearly more worthy than others. We have two starting points this week, about 600 kilometers apart, Mosul and Aleppo.
Both Mosul and Aleppo are cities now under siege. The difference is that Mosul is an operation being conducted by Western forces and their allies, and Aleppo is an operation being conducted by the Syrian regime and their allies, the Russians.
In Mosul, the battle is more about fighting terrorism. It is clearer who the bad guys are. In the case of Aleppo, because of the complexity of the conflict, it is less easy to draw a line between who the bad guys are and who the good guys are.
If you monitor both mainstream Western media and mainstream Russian media, you often get the sense that they're mirror opposites. So the Western media talks about civilian deaths in eastern Aleppo.
Massive airstrike flattened a building in eastern Aleppo.
The Russian media has a strong focus on the atrocities or the attacks on civilians allegedly being carried out by the rebels.
Террористы фактически держат в заложниках сотни тысяч горожан, отрезают им головы, расстреливают и пытают.
It's very unfortunate if the media in the West and the media in Russia do not notice that the same things are happening in these two unhappy cities.
Now sending more warplanes to Syria.
In the same way that one man's terrorist can be another man's freedom fighter, what one journalist calls a bombardment,
While Russian warplanes bombarded it.
another calls a targeted strike, a mission accomplished.
Самолеты и летчики, выполнившие боевую задачу по уничтожению террористов в Сирии, возвращаются домой.
The terminology used and the issues emphasized on the Aleppo and Mosul stories often come down to whether the news outlet doing the reporting is based in Moscow, Damascus, Baghdad, or Washington.
We see that Western ministries put out footage of airstrikes against ISIS positions in Iraq, blowing up ISIS-controlled oil wells, destroying ISIS trucks. So basically, you're showing it as clinical strikes. However, we know that, even with the best of intentions, you do have civilians being killed, just as civilians have been killed by the Russians and the Syrian Air Force. In fact, just today, Amnesty International put out a report saying that 300 civilians have been killed in American airstrikes in just 11 raids.
There are two main threads that Russian media focuses on. One of them is the strength of the Russian military, and that Russia is pulling its weight on the world stage.
Ведь до сих пор американцы даже не принимали во внимание простую возможность. Кто-то еще, кроме Пентагона, может заявить о господстве в воздухе.
The second is that Russia is targeting terrorists, and there's very little mention that Russia has been bombing civilians. The focus instead is on the terrorist threat that there is within Syria, which is both Islamic State and al-Nusra.
There is a simplistic notion about extremists versus moderates, and this has made the situation on the ground appear to be a clear battle between those who have a jihadist tag versus those who don't. If we compare what is happening on the ground with Mosul, we have the Shia militias, and these are characterized positively or negatively depending on who is doing the reporting. And they have been documented to have engaged in some rather questionable behavior, mainly towards towards Sunnis in Iraq.
These are the kinds of news stories, multi-layered and rife with complexity, in which the use of journalistic shorthand falls short. There are too many actors, too many factions, too many military and paramilitary players involved to be boiled down into facile good versus evil summaries and simple sound bites. However, that kind of shorthand is here to stay. There are too many news outlets in too many places chasing too few viewers for it to stop. And the fog of war, a term that's now more than a century old, used to describe the confusion that envelops and surrounds just about any military conflict, ain't what it used to be.
30 or 40 years ago, the fog of war was about the difficulties of getting to certain places, the difficulties of filming them. Now the fog of war is mostly inside the editorial offices of various media outlets. The media in the West doesn't notice the civilian casualties in Mosul, just like the Russian media doesn't always notice the civilian casualties in Aleppo. So I think most of the fog of war is about the editorial line, and it's about certain prejudices existing in societies.
There is also an agenda at play as to how much emphasis to give to certain aspects, depending on who you're working for and who your audience is. How much emphasis to give to civilian casualties, for example.
But in the case of Aleppo and Mosul, at least international journalists are looking, reporting, even live streaming. There's another conflict in the Middle East that, like Syria and Iraq, started as a civil war and has drawn in regional powers, one of which is American-backed. An estimated 10,000 dead, 4,000 of them civilians. And, according to the United Nations, millions are now at risk of starvation in Yemen.
Similarly to Western media, perhaps even more so, there is very little, almost nothing, I would say, in mainstream Russian media about Yemen. Often Russian media only reports statements of officials. I think that's the only way the Yemen story would make its way into Russian media.
Also, I think in the West, since there is Saudi Arabia involved, and Saudi Arabia has such a powerful lobby, the Western media is not particularly interested in covering something that may make Saudi Arabia look bad.
In the case of the Middle East, we can't really separate what is happening in Iraq from what is happening in Syria or even what is happening in Yemen and Libya. The problem with picking and choosing on part of the media to focus on the most immediate conflict while ignoring long-term raging conflicts is that it risks presenting these conflicts as being isolated from other conflicts taking place. It is all part of one big story, and this is missed when the media just focus on one thing.